You found us through fly fishing. You'll stay for our passion and the community. Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Podcast.
Yeah, but he doesn't get it. How come fly fishermen don't get it?
You only haul with the short power snap.
Look for where people walk and the insides of bends and hunt those.
The roof blew off and the interior walls got sucked out. And the trees are just coming up. And I mean, he's clearly not going to clear the trees.
It is not a fly fishing story. It's a story about me trying to understand my brother through fly fishing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
We've been waiting for you. Follow our guests, follow us on Instagram, and share this episode and the love if you enjoy this podcast. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. How you doing, Hal?
Well, Dave, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah. Thanks for putting this some time here today to talk about some important topics. I don't know your full background. I know you have this amazing podcast, which reaches out to a lot of people. You're connected to Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, which is a very important group, and you got a lot more going on. So let's just take it back really quick before we jump into everything on all that. Let's talk about how you first got into hunting and fishing. Has this been around your whole life? Where did you grow up? What's your first memory?
That's a big question. I've been hunting and fishing since I was really little. Probably I started hunting when I was 9. But I grew up outside. Well, we were in North Alabama in what's now the giant city of Huntsville. And when I was 11, my parents, they had never been happy in town. They bought a piece of ground out of town and we lived out. So I was raised out in the country there, which was kind of the origin story of if I've got one.
Yep.
But I was hunting. I had good people in my life. My father was really busy, but he had grown up in South Alabama and loved it. He knew how to fish and hunt and hunt. He didn't hunt much, but they were like good enablers. Like my mother cooked everything. She cooked rabbits and squirrels, and she was not a hunter at all. But they were great enablers. And then I was obsessed with fishing since my earliest memory. I don't understand how the key fits in that lock, really. Yep. But I was obsessed with what fish were doing when I wasn't watching. I remember in first grade drawing pictures of this hole in this, it's called Aldridge Creek, and what all the fish were doing down in there.
Nice.
And I was like first grade, like you're supposed to be drawing a clock on a paper plate, which, by the way, I failed. I got a factory, but I drew pictures of brim and crappie and catfish. I was obsessed with catfish and red horse suckers.
Nice.
Yeah. I don't have an explanation for that,
Yeah, that's amazing. So you pretty much, since day one, you had it in you. What I love that your parents, you're in town and then they moved out to this property. What was that like? Was that when you moved out there? And I asked this because we've been talking a little about doing some moving around and we've got a couple little kids and I'm always interested. Like for you, was that a game changer when you moved out? Did you love that?
It's hard to imagine. I like thinking about what are unbelievably positive things sometime, that occur in life. And that was a game changer beyond all my my understanding. It was like being released into just an infinite world. I don't know. I can't. Yep. It's hard to explain. It was everything that I was looking for. Because as a little kid, I read like James Fenimore Cooper, and I read Zane Grey. The Spirit of the Border, and all I wanted was to roam around in those incredible hardwood forests and bottomlands of Alabama, and look at things and fish and hunt.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, I'm 11 years old, which is a good age because you're self-sufficient somewhat, right?
Yep.
And all of a sudden, I was there, and it was all there in front of you. It was amazing. I can remember putting number 4 shot in one pocket, number 8s for in case you saw doves, number 4s in case there were ducks on the creek, and then for squirrels as well. And then you just go study the creek and wait for these red horse to show up in March. That would be like the end of all the hunting season, the beginning of the fishing. We had a county lake, a county public fishing lake near there, and the crappie would start showing up there like April 2nd. Then as the red horse moved out of the creek.
Wow.
It was incredible. And my parents had a big garden that I had to work in, and that took too. You're talking about like things you don't like and things you do, you know?
Yep.
I mean, and to this day, I still grow this huge garden, and we live off of that.
Wow.
There's certain things just work out.
Yep.
And of course, many things don't, right?
Yeah. You probably didn't realize it, right? That's the thing at the time, what your parents did, but it was a major thing that probably guided a lot of your life now. And do you look back at it and see that move your parents made a big influence on where you are now?
100%. The other thing it did was I did farm work in, late middle school and high school. And so when I was 24, 25, I came to Montana. I just put my name up at the co-op like, need a job, And I was driving tractor on a hay crew. I don't know, like 48 hours later.
Wow. That's amazing.
And I couldn't have done that. Had I grown up in town, I wouldn't have had that option.
Yeah. Right. So you start out in Alabama. What is that, how does that move out west? It seems like we've talked to a lot of people who have made the move out west, and all that. How was that for you? Did you make some move? Did you make a trip out somewhere and then say like, hey, this is the place I want to be?
In a way I did. Yeah. I was already writing then. And, I got into the Yellow Bay Writers Workshop, which was on Flathead Lake in Montana. And Tom McGuane was teaching there, and Anik Smith was running it. Anik Smith, who was then was with Bill Kittredge, who's one of the great prose writers of Montana and the Wet. He's passed on now. But it was a gathering of writers from around the West. And I went there on the train, and I met Phil Condon. He's a writer out of Missoula. Great guy. And that was the fires of 1988. And I was in a bar in it is Whitefish. It used to be a logging town. Now it's like the Glitterati. But I think it was the Paradise Bar in there. And this guy came in and he said, we're hiring on fire crew. We're hiring truck drivers. And I was looking around and I just thought, well, hell, a person could live here.
Yeah.
And if you were hard up in the bar, somebody comes and hires you to go on fire crew.
Yep.
I was about 20. I think I was 24 then.
Wow, that's so cool. God, so you just did
a different world.
Yeah, you just did it though. I mean, it feels like you just went out and you said, "Hey, I want to go do this," and figured it out. And you kind of figured it out on your own. Met some people that were good mentors along the way. Is that how it worked?
That is how it worked. And the added thing was that on the train, there was a young man named Denny, somebody who was from Whitefish, and he was a tree. This kind of gets me into a longer story,
yeah.
But he was a tree planter, a Hodad tree planter, and I was a Hodad tree planter in Alabama working for the paper company as a contractor. And when he found out that I was a tree planter, he was extremely nice to me. Like, we went out and drank beers, and I realized then that for every real tree planter these guys recruited, they got a bonus.
Oh, right.
And so he was telling me all about how tree planting worked in the Rocky Mountains, and I got obsessed with that. When I went home, I knew that's what I was going to come back and do. And it actually took me a few years to get on a tree planting crew here. It was not it was like fishing for bluegills versus spearing tuna.
Right.
Tree planting in Alabama versus tree planting in the Rockies.
Yeah, right.
But anyway, that's kind of how that worked. I just saw all these. It was the same things I was doing in Alabama, but writ on a somewhat larger canvas.
Skwala Fly Fishing, combining advanced materials with fishing-focused, purpose-built design. Skwala waders, jackets, shirts, pants, and insulation are made for us. To help Wet Fly Swing listeners right now, Skwala is offering a 10% discount on your next order. Just visit skwalafishing.com and use the coupon code WetFlySwing10 at checkout. That's Skwala, SKWALA. Gear for us, the serious angler. What is because you have this amazing podcast with all these topics, in the conservation and the writing. When did that, for you, the conservation piece, and you have all this, the public lands, but there's a lot into it. We've talked to a lot of great groups, Trout Unlimited, FFI, many groups like like BHA sort of thing. But for you, when did the conservation start? When did you start thinking about that?
Well, it was a natural outgrowth. When I grew up reading Field and Stream and Sports Afield and Outdoor Life, right? Mm-hmm. And every other fishing and hunting magazine there was. Full Cry, the magazine of dogs, and then Fur Fishing Game. And all of that, those magazines all had a conservation element back then, because without that conservation, none of the hunting and fishing existed, And I'll tell you, Dave, if you grew up in the 70s, early 80s like that, you saw the kind of development replacing the woods and fields. I tell people this story. The longest shot I've ever seen intentionally made on a whitetail was a buddy of mine on the porch of his little house. He said, kind of like one of those things, watch this.
Yeah.
And it was an 825-yard shot.
Jeez.
With a Browning. And we went and picked up that deer and dragged it back. And there must be 8 or 9 houses between where he stood on that porch and where we picked up that deer.
Wow. Just shot like that was a normal thing back then?
It was not abnormal. He owned that land. He had about 750 acres in there. And that's all houses now.
Yeah. And
that creek has fish in it and stuff, but it has suffered the torments of the damned. And if you witness that as a fisherman and a hunter and a kind of just a person who lives in it, I don't know how you can be anything but an activist in conservation.
Yeah.
Because it's so clear that it either you act to conserve or your kids and grandchildren don't have it.
Yeah.
It's just an obvious equation.
Right. So you saw that just from your own. You didn't have to, you read a lot too, but.
I was reading it. I grew up, Ted Trueblood was still, I think I was reading older Ted Trueblood stuff in Outdoor Life, the back page of Field and Stream, all of it, and it was all kind of integrated to just the joy of hunting and fishing. Like Pat McManus was writing those incredibly funny pieces, and they're all based on living in a place that has clean water and beautiful hunting and fishing. And those things don't exist by accident. It was so clear to me. I watched them channelize that Aldridge Creek in Huntsville. And this is probably awful, but we used to shoot minnows with BB guns,
Oh, yeah.
And we would just live on Aldridge Creek as little bitty kids, like 8, 7.
Yeah.
And they not just channelized it, they cemented that creek, which caused so much trouble. Like 25 years later, they were trying to restore it.
Right.
Yeah. And because it was just a disaster. But they cemented the place where we, as little kids, we kind of lived this feral existence.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, there was no room for the feral, right?
Dang.
It was gone.
Yeah.
And that was 8 years old.
That was 8 years old, yeah. And, there's so many examples of that, and I don't want to ever get into these episodes trying to paint a negative picture of, everything, climate change, changes in our stuff. But I think it's actually a positive. I'm an optimistic person, so I actually see where we're heading. I see a lot of good things.
Oh man,
right? Do you see that too? Do you stay in all this stuff? Give me some, the optimistic view of everything. Like, what's your take?
Oh, well, the optimistic view is that the world is incredibly powerful, and you can like this restoration work that I'm helping with right now on these sagebrush landscapes.
Yeah.
You can act and have an immediate result. I follow this guy, Kyle Liebarger, down in Alabama. He's got Native Habitat Project. Mm-hmm. He's like an Instagram, he's an unlikely Instagram hero because he's just like a really normal Alabama hunting, fishing botanist.
Yep.
But they do pollinator belts and grassland restorations on any scale. And, you know, pollinator belts in people's yards produce this incredible amount of like biodiversity right away, immediately. And I just see, I see a huge amount. This dam removal stuff we're doing all over the country. All you have to do, I like things that are, I've learned, even though I'm a writer and stuff, and I have a big imagination, I guess. I like things that are actionable, observable, quantifiable. And that kind of conservation is all three of those things, you know, writ large, man. You can do so much, and people are learning more and more. I mean, local agriculture is exploding right now because people want good food. And those kind of things are fostering elements of biodiversity that we didn't have. I see a rising tide of just understanding, and it's almost like a renaissance in human thinking on this stuff. So yes, I'm not just optimistic. I love it.
Yeah.
I think it's fine. You know, we're running neck and neck with a lot of problems, but what is the main problem? The main problem is indifference.
Yeah.
It's not hatred. It's not ignorance.
No.
It's indifference. And who is less indifferent? Who is more like motivated than a person who loves to fish?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, that river that you understand as a fly fisherman, because that's kind of a next level study.
Yep.
You know, you can drift a night crawler on a circle hook and do a lot.
Yeah.
But to dry fly fish a river is to study that river and to kind of immerse oneself in the whole system, right?
Right.
And you are going to know that place and fight for that place in a way that it's the opposite of indifference.
Yeah, you're in it. And I'm definitely more of a fisherman, but, you know, I still do some hunting, and I feel like hunting for me, it's the same thing. Like, I remember starting out hunting and I've gotten better at it. And now, you know, I'm at this other level where, you have this connection to the habitat, nature, and, you know, when you shoot an animal, it's a whole thing, you know, this whole thing, it's hard to explain. But it sounds like you do a little both, hunting, fishing. Are you kind of are you equal, or do you do a lot of both of those?
I do a lot of both. And just lately, my hunting has been less because of work. And hunting here is a big commitment. Like, I don't have horses, but you know, it's like you go into, say, the Bob Marshall or Scapegoat Wilderness, and there's a lot of, there's not as much just easy hunting. And so I try to kill all of our meat every year. But some years that does.
Yeah. Are you in Idaho, or where are you at?
I'm in central Montana.
Oh, central Montana. Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I came here in the late 80s. I think the first year I was legal, I killed a 5x5 bull behind this ranch that I was working on.
Yeah.
Buddy, I thought again, it was one of these things where you just changes your life, you know?
Yeah.
God. And I didn't kill another one for 5 years. I found out both how it can be done and how difficult it can be too.
Yeah.
And that just hooked me even more, you know?
Yeah.
But I grew up, that whitetail hunting in Alabama, still something I totally love. I've never gotten over my infatuation like with Alabama. I was in the Bankhead National Forest last winter, and that's in like central Alabama there. I don't know that I've ever seen any place that was more fascinating than that in my whole life.
Yeah.
And I've been lucky in traveling around, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. We've done episodes kind of like you all over the, you know, everywhere, but we're doing more and more, you know, down south, down out in that neck of the woods. And the more you get into it, you realize, there's all sorts of amazing resources, fish species you hadn't heard of, people are chasing. Yeah, right. All these things. We did a red-eyed bass was a species we did an episode on recently, and I didn't know anything about it.
Who was that with, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh man, what was that? I'm drawing up. We do so many guests now. I'm drawing up. Like I'll find that for you, Hal.
That's fine. Yeah, that is that fly fishing for red eye is what got me into fly fishing in high school.
Oh, no kidding.
Yeah,
Oh, wow. Well, here it is. You should check this out, too. If you don't, well, you probably know Matt, but Matt Lewis, he's a conservation.
Yeah, I know him well.
Yeah.
I know him well.
516. We'll put a link in the show notes to that one. It was a really awesome episode.
Okay, yeah, he is awesome in that. Some of those bankhead rivers, they're like, that's the headwaters of all that stuff, right?
Yep.
And, yeah, I just, I did a lot of that. I had a little eagle claw, big eagle claw fish, rod and reel with an automatic reel.
Yeah.
When I was really young, and it turned out my father was he was a good fly fisherman for bass.
Huh.
And I didn't know that until I was like 9 years old because he was so busy.
Huh.
And I watched him catch a big one on a popper, a big largemouth on a popper. And again, like I was like, holy smokes, look at this. And then he gave me that eagle claw. And then years later, I kind of rousted it out when I got a driver's license.
Oh, yeah.
And I started figuring out red eye.
God.
And, yeah.
That's so cool. Well,
yeah.
What did your dad do?
He was a lawyer.
A lawyer. Oh, wow.
And I had 4 sisters. So, and they were all in college. We were older than I was. They were all in college at the same time. So when I was coming along, he worked like he was, I don't know, I wouldn't say he was a workaholic. He had to work. He worked all the time. And, that paid for our like life out there in the country, in the Southern Cumberlands and all. But he was very busy, and he had come up on the Chattahoochee River, and he had been a fly fisherman. He had me when he was older. So this goes way back, like he was in World War II.
Oh, wow.
But they fished the Chattahoochee in Alabama around Lynette, Alabama, Chambers County. And back so long ago, and he was big into conservation too because he loved nature and he loved beautiful like trees and stuff like that. And he had seen that same thing that I grew up in where, like the clear cutting of the southern hardwoods and stuff like that. So he was really aware of all that stuff. That was part of our life, like talking about that stuff.
Right. Wow. So yeah, so you definitely had a good influence early from your dad. Even though he was working a lot, he was still a big influence on your, sounds like your conservation and outdoor stuff.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Huh. Wow. It seems like now, with like you guys and all with podcasting and just this everything, right? All this content stuff, the Meat Eater, right? All the groups. Seems like there's just tons of resources out there. Do you find like nowadays, what's your take on all that? Do you feel like you've been involved in, and we can get into the podcast. I want to hear about how that started, but
Sure.
Did you jump into, have you always loved this social media, the podcasting, all that, or is this kind of an add-on you figured like you had to do?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't because I had to do it. But it was an add-on. I never did anything with that. I didn't. It was outside of my wheelhouse, if you will.
Yeah. And
I didn't. We were talking about like being busy and stuff.
Yeah.
Like I never bow hunted because September. I always had about 3 buckets of income as a self-employed person, right? And one of those was working doing forestry work, which I've been doing since I was 19. And so I was always finishing up. If you're in Montana and you do forestry work, September that's the end.
Yeah.
Whatever you get done in September, that's going to be it, So I was always like away from home in the woods working in September, and I would come home mid-October and go hunting. So there wasn't a lot of time for social media type stuff. I wasn't even aware of that stuff. And I was at a camp out with Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, and a young woman named Jill Albin was there, and myself and Greg Munther, he's probably 80 years old now, retired Forest Service, unbelievable trad bow hunter. And Munther and I were standing around this fire, and he was talking to me. I was asking him questions. He has some of the greatest experience of anybody I've ever known, in the woods hunting. And Jill came to me later, and she said, "Do you know that you could have recorded that conversation, and in these memories, this history would be available, like to people who would love to hear it?" And that was the birth of, this is true. This is the origin story.
Cool.
That's the birth of this podcast.
Nice.
And that's an honest story about how this came to be. I had looked into, I've been a reporter as a third of my income for all my life. And I had looked into like vlogs, VLOG.
Sure.
Because as a reporter, the rise of the internet, killed the magazines.
Yeah.
And so I was always looking for how do you survive, right?
Yeah.
So I had been looking into this, but I have a really short attention span. And none of it had ever come to fruition until Jill talked to me about this podcast, and about a year later, we had it set up.
There you go. And what year was that when you set it up? You had first episode?
I'm saying that was 2023, probably 2018.
Yeah, 2018.
17, yeah.
Yeah, right in the same time when we launched ours, about the same time.
Yeah, and it was when the technology was coming around, too, that somebody like me, who's not a technology person, could actually handle it.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing, is everything has gotten easier in the last 5-10 years for doing this.
Yeah, and I don't see that as a bad thing.
No.
I see it as your podcast, my podcast, it rises or falls on its own merits.
Yep.
And I think it's awesome because when I was coming up early as a writer, the gatekeepers were kind of a big problem.
Right, yeah, the gatekeeper, you had these massive magazines or these big, right, there's a few people that were running the show and you had to get in there. Is that how it worked?
That is how it works. And I was lucky, and then with Field and Stream, they were good to me. But other gatekeepers, and I'll never name this, but
Sure.
One time I had a story that I was pitching about a man who was a famous botanist. And it turned out that he had been living under an alias his whole life, and he had actually escaped from this kind of marijuana charge.
Oh, wow.
And the gatekeeper woman at this magazine said, let me get this clear. You want me to pay you to write a story about somebody who's nobody has ever heard of? And I was like, well, this is one of the most interesting human beings I've ever known.
Yeah.
And she was like, nope.
Oh, wow. There you go. You just can't do it.
Yeah, you just couldn't do it. Like,
Wow.
And I never had any capital.
Yeah. Sure.
I mean, I wasn't a venture capitalist. There was nothing there. I ventured from paycheck to paycheck.
Right. Like most of us. That's the thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I welcomed the advent of this more democratic form, which, we call social media or podcast and blogging. And blogging's kind of passed on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, it has. I mean, it still works. But you know what? I've talked a lot about this, but with the podcast, and I've done everything, the blogging, I've tried it all. But you find that thing that resonates with you. And podcasts for me, the first episode I recorded, it was like instantly I knew this was the thing. You know what I mean? And after failing for a lot, did you find yourself, I don't know, in your career, what was that thing for you that just clicked? Was it writing? What was that thing when you knew you were going to have a career, this was going to be your life?
I think publishing, I worked for High Country News. They kind of gave me a start, and they're out of Paonia, Colorado. That's a Western news magazine. But hitting Field and Stream and having that, this was snail mail stuff, right?
Yep.
And getting that check and getting that letter saying, well, this is really interesting. I want to work with you. And I was like, holy smokes, this is actually working. And at the time, I was thinning timber. I had a collapse I had thinned timber for 3 months in Montana and found out that the main contractor had defaulted on these things that I had subcontracted.
Oh, God.
And I couldn't get paid, and I was 3 months in. And so that Field and Stream thing, I think it was $1,700, $1,500,
Wow. For one article.
Yeah, for one article. And that was and it was an entry, level. And I was like, man, this is really good. This is something I can do. And I did eventually get paid for those thinning contracts. But it showed me the tenuous nature of depending on that kind of thing. And writing then, it worked. And talk about a tenuous nature. I used to have a self-drawn cartoon of a skeleton waiting by a mailbox for a writing check.
Yeah, because you got it. I mean, that's not the easiest thing to do. Either we've interviewed a number of successful authors, and John Garrock always comes to the top, and I think about him. But he talked about that same thing. When he got started, you got to get used to, failure still, like everybody, right? Till you get there. And they were never there. Right? You're never really there either.
No, you're never there. You're as good as your last story. And one of the big things about that, I think Garak would definitely say this too, is if you sit around and rest and like go on a spree with the check, and you don't start on the next story right away, you're going to be really hungry. But yeah, failure is a huge part of it, man.
Yeah, failure. Yeah, exactly. What was that first article in Field of Stream? Sounds like that was your first big one. Do you remember what that article, like the title, what that was about?
It was about captive trophy shooting in this rise in, they called it game farming, And they were doing it. This is a long story because there was a ballot initiative in Montana to ban the practice, and that ballot initiative came about because of not because of my work, but because right in conjunction with the stories I was publishing about whether people thought this was an interest. I didn't care if you wanted to shoot captive elk on your property. What was happening was they were building these giant fences to contain them.
Oh, wow.
And they were blocking a native wild mule deer migration route.
Oh, man, not good. Yeah.
And these deer were getting like hammered on Highway 93 in the Bitterroot Valley.
Yep.
And I was like, whoa, what does it mean to have wild game displaced by this facade or fall fake trophy shooting thing? And I got into it really heavy. And that story was in Field and Stream. It was a great time in my life because I had hit on a topic that resonated with a lot of different people in the world,
Yeah.
But it was a question about hunting, right? It's a question about what do we seek in hunting. It was a question about the who owns native wildlife.
Mm.
And you fence them in.
Right,
right. And the answer in Montana was no, you cannot.
No.
And this was a small community, Dave, so I knew many of the players.
Oh, wow. So you knew the people that were fencing in the animals and owning the property.
Well, they had come from California to buy this place and do that, but I knew their employees. So you would say I wasn't at the level of the folks buying, 2,000 acres. But I was certainly at the level of the guy who dug the fence post holes.
Fly fishing is always in full swing at Drifthook. Let Drifthook Fly Fishing outfit you with the perfect assortment of flies to prepare for your next adventure. Everything from nips to dry flies, hoppers to streamers, and their Euronip fly kits. All are pre-packed in a double-sided water-resistant fly box. These kits ship free directly to your door, ready to start catching some fish. If you're starting out or just looking for additional tips to help you catch more fish, Drifthook.com has over 50 instructional videos and over 200 articles to help you improve your fly fishing game. And I want to reiterate this fact right here that Drifthook has a great resource at the website. Matt has put together some awesome blog posts. And these aren't just flabby blog posts. They are packed with lots of great content to help you on your next adventure, wherever it takes you this year. With over 150 verified 5-star reviews and a 30-day money-back guarantee, Drifthook's family-owned business has you covered. You can order right now at drifthook.com and use the code SWING at checkout to get 15% off your first order. That's Drifthook, Drifthook, drifthook.com, and use SWING, SWING, at checkout to get 15% off your first order. You support this podcast and a great small company right now by checking out that link at Drifthook. So that, to me, that topic is just seeing, and I'm not sure what year was that when that article went out?
99.
Yeah, 99. So it just seems to me, I was hunting, plenty. I've been hunting a long time. So, it just seems so crazy. I understand the challenges and business and stuff like that, but when you look at that right now and you look around the country, is that stuff still permitted in some form in other areas, other states?
In Montana, it's not, but in other states, for sure. They've learned, because of the rise of chronic wasting disease in the trade in these animals, they are less vocal than they were. But yeah, certainly it's still a thing for sure.
Because that seems like the biggest challenge always, right? And I think that's what BHA, we talk a little bit about them, but it seems like the biggest challenge in this country and probably any country is the fragmented habitats, and the more we can connect those and give animals a chance to migrate freely, the better. So what would those people say if you talked to that person who owned the 2,000, who was trying to fence them in, and you said, hey, you're impacting these other wild creatures? What do you think they would say?
Oh, I know what he said. He said that the State Fish and Game Agency has a product, and it's a mule deer or elk, and I have a product that's so much better than theirs that they don't want the competition.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And it was a little bit different way of viewing the earth.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I go back, and again, this is the extreme, and I know I love to throw out, this sometimes, but we're watching the Ken Burns, the American Buffalo, which is an amazing.
Yeah, it's really good. I've watched the first half just last night.
Yeah. Okay. So, it's a story of, we basically wiped out the buffalo so we could, basically take out the Native Americans and have this country. And even Teddy Roosevelt, right, said in that movie, and he said, hey, we couldn't have what we had here as a country. Maybe even the world would be different without us doing that. So it almost felt like he was saying you had to do that to get where we are. Maybe this guy, same thing, right? These businesses are saying they're thinking the same thing.
I think we had to go through that because nobody was asking those questions. What is hunting? At the time, you couldn't register one of those giant monster bulls that they were producing in the fence with the Boone and Crockett Club as a legitimate trophy animal.
Oh, right.
So that question came up. What is free roaming wildlife? What value does that have? What value does it have to have a migration path for mule deer or antelope so that they survive into the future?
Yeah.
And the genesis is all there in that Teddy Roosevelt era.
Yeah.
When we had done so much damage that you could see it was an end game.
Yeah.
There's an incredible interview. It's old. This guy's name was A.A. Anderson, and he was the first supervisor of the what became the Shoshone National Forest in Wyoming. And one of the things that he did, which he thought was crazy, he hated it, was to stop the Bannock people, who are the Shoshone Bannock Native Americans, from an antelope hunt in May, which was a traditional thing that they had been doing for like 1,000 years or more, because there weren't any antelope left because the white settlers had killed them all off.
Jeez. And
A.A. Anderson was he was a professional artist, and he was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. And he said, this is one of the greatest ironies, and it was a big deal. Like they got into a battle over it. The Bannock people couldn't believe that anybody would stop them from doing something they'd been doing forever.
Yeah. Just
because they knew the invaders had killed so much game that there wasn't enough left.
Jeez.
But it was a time of, I tell people nowadays, that was a time of choices, and a small number of very powerful and good people empowered by other people made those choices so that we have all this stuff today. And truth is, we're in another one right now because the population is triple what it was then. And so if we want these things to continue, we have to choose them now. We have to choose that.
How do we do that? People are listening now, and we all love the outdoors and fishing and hunting. What do you tell somebody that's sitting here like thinking, man, I don't know what to do. Like, how can I have an impact on this? What do you tell that person?
I think that you have to join these groups, for one thing. Like Trout Unlimited has a lot of that small-scale dam removal stuff going on that is incredibly positive.
Yep.
They have a lot of creek restoration. Ducks Unlimited is, and it's funny that I'm speaking on behalf of all these nonprofits, but they are one of the best mechanisms to have an impact. Ducks Unlimited is the greatest wetlands on scale conservation group in the world. And they work a lot on private land, right?
Right.
And so they have liaisons with private landowners who, because of the nature of America, they own some of the most valuable properties, and they have the right to either fix them or, get rid of them. And so Ducks Unlimited has been incredibly successful. Waterfowl is doing better. Mm-hmm. And that's because of groups like Ducks Unlimited. It's because of the Federal Migratory Bird Act, which incentivizes landowners to conserve wetlands instead of getting rid of them, right?
Right.
I ask people a lot, like, to look into the Waters of the U.S. Rule controversy, which is, how are we going to conserve our major rivers if we don't have a mechanism for conserving wetlands and tributary creeks?
Right.
And that's the WOTUS controversy, Waters of the U.S.
Mm.
And I've written about that ad nauseum. And I have less of an answer now than I did when I begun.
Yeah.
Because before the Supreme Court decisions, which redefined the Clean Water Act as being very specific to navigable waterways, the Environmental Protection Agency had taken on the powers to regulate wetlands and not let people pollute tributary creeks and stuff like that, right?
Yep.
But those Supreme Court decisions brought the EPA's powers back into just navigable waterways.
Oh, wow. Which is a very small amount of the rivers and waterways, right?
It is. And it worked great under the 1972 Clean Water Act, which stopped people from pouring like toxic effluent directly into the Tennessee River. But as development has spread out and farming has gone in a much different direction than it did back then, we have the tributaries and the wetlands. It's like you saying, well, I protected my main arteries.
Yeah.
You know, I just put a little Drano into the veins of my hands.
God, jeez.
You know?
Yeah.
So we're at a crossroads there, and we're at this crossroads at a time when somehow we've decided that we don't like the federal government. And I don't really, but if you look at how we got the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, all these things, those are all federal level rules, laws.
They are.
Passed by Congress.
Yeah.
And for those of us who, and I'm one of them, who believe in the 10th Amendment, which empowers the states, you know.
Yep.
The states have not picked up that slack. They have not been able to pass those laws.
No. I mean, that is why the federal government is so, amazing and why it's there. It's the big stuff, when we can't figure it out at the state, because there are times when the local level is great and works great, but there are times when the federal government.
In an ideal world, it would all be done at the local level.
Exactly.
But that has not been the case at all.
No.
And so we've leaned on this federal government of the 1970s. If you look at the major environmental, like the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, you look at that stuff, you think, wow, what were we doing? You know, God. Doug Brinkley has a book called Silent Spring Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
And that book explains exactly what we're talking about. Who were we in 1972 when Nixon signed the Clean Water Act, you know?
Yep.
And what we were was a nation that was exhausted by pollution. And we had given up on the idea that anybody could be totally relied upon to not wreck it for all of us. And, you know, freedom implies a lot of individual responsibility. And when you're pumping your toxic effluent into the Tennessee River because you don't want to pay to have it hauled off, you're not exhibiting personal responsibility.
God. Yeah, we did one of our partners on a recent event we did was the River Keeper, and it was out kind of on the East Coast. And we heard the story, of how that got going. And part of it is the lawsuits, right? That's, I think, at a certain point, you kind of need that piece. You hate to go there, but sometimes you have to go there, and that's how some of this gets going. But, I mean, what's your take on that?
It was a blizzard of litigation that led to the Clean Air Act as well.
Oh, it was? Okay.
And if you look back at the genesis of that, I think it was this Georgia pecan growers whose pecan orchards that dated back to the Civil War had been killed by coal-fired power smoke, you know? And the people who were polluting realized that this litigation would literally, just ruin everything for them.
Yep.
So they needed a baseline. And the Clean Water Act, the same. I did a profile of Ray Scott, who founded the Bass Angler Sportsman Society. He's the father of all the bass tournaments.
Mm-hmm.
And Ray, to me, he's an American hero. before the Clean Water Act of 1972, Ray and Bass Angler Sportsman Society probably filed more lawsuits against polluters in the Tennessee River system than anybody ever has or will again. And he called it Bubba Power.
Nice. That's perfect.
And they just weren't going to put up with it anymore. They loved to fish for bass. He had the tournament set up. He's making some revenue.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just like, you don't have the right to pour that poison into this river that we all fish in and depend on for drinking water. That is not your right.
No.
And I think he used the Rivers and Harbors Act, which was a really early anti-pollution ordinance, like from the 1800s.
Mm.
And that was the basis for the civil lawsuits that they filed. And they won. And it was so obvious that they were right under the law, right, that we eventually got the Clean Water Act of 1972. And Nixon signed it.
Huh. Wow. Got all that was going. What do you, when you look at that time, and it sounds like you know that well, the 70s, that period of all that, versus now, 2023, where we're at. I mean, are there any similarities, lots of similarities of where we are with other challenges?
There are a huge number of similarities. The difference is that people, even my age, I'm 59.
Yeah.
So we have been the beneficiaries of all that stuff for so long that we forgot how we got it.
All right.
People don't understand why the river is safe to swim in. It was supposed to be 80% of U.S. waters fishable or drinkable by fishable and swimmable, excuse me. Like by 1980, 1990, something like that. And we almost hit that goal, and now we're going back the other way, and that's mostly because of non-point source pollution.
Yep.
And it's mostly runoff from our current agricultural model.
Ag.
And runoff from impermeable surfaces.
Just the cities, the concrete, the cities and the ag, or all that stuff running off, and the oils. As you sit there, you go to a parking lot and look down and you see a oil stream coming out of the car next to you. Right, all that. Is that what we're talking about, part of it?
Yeah, that's the impermeable surfaces stuff. And storm drains that drain directly into rivers without a wetland buffer.
Yep.
But the vast majority of it right now is nitrate runoff from ag.
Mm.
And the current model of corn ethanol, which is a totally federally subsidized activity.
Yep, right. So there you go. So you have the federal government on both sides. You got the EPA, but you also have them maybe doing some things that aren't helping.
Oh, completely, and they always have.
Yeah.
They've always been one of the biggest problems and the only main solution. I mean, that's the nature of governance. I always compare it to like a big Chevy Silverado pickup truck with a pistol in the console.
Oh, wow.
Right. It's a dangerous thing that you can use to drive to the grocery store, or you can run over, some lady going home from work, or you can do all these things with government, right? It is as the people direct it.
Yeah.
But it's a dangerous power, and it's a power, we're going to have it because people demand governance.
Yeah.
It's just, what is it going to do? And I choose it to do, like, protect the environment and protect, and have a military so people can't invade and stuff. And it's the mistrust or the anti-government movement, which I've covered as a reporter for years.
Oh, you have?
Yeah. And it's just so immature,
yeah.
Dave. It's as if there were some alternative, right?
Right. Well, and for me, when I look at that, I think of the mistrust of the government. I mean, I think that, sure, there's going to be bad apples and everything. Police, there's going to be a small percentage of people in every field, whatever. And that's all it is that you have that. But for the most part, people are good, and you have to give them a chance to do good, right? Like, is that kind of how you see it a little bit?
I do. And I also see it's just this thing about the government. It's like we probably have done this the best with our U.S. Constitution of anybody in history, because the Constitution was created from the careful study of the failures of the past,
Right.
And so the thing is but it's a participatory democratic republic.
Yeah.
It relies on the people participating. And if you're indifferent to the environment, the government is not going to pick up. It's not going to do that.
No.
And then you're left with more degradation. You know, like the saving the buffalo, right? We had Yellowstone National Park. That's the world's first national park. Well, that's where the buffalo held out.
Barely, right?
Yeah, barely. And that's because they were protected by the cavalry at the time, you know?
The cavalry, and there were still, like in that, there were still poachers trying to take them down even after you got to that point, right? There were still people out there trying to take them out.
There were lots of people who could not comprehend that anybody would want to save anything ever.
Yeah. Well, and again, you look at what's going on now. I mean, again, cocked fish or whatever, but, Alaska, and this is a different thing, but I mean, king salmon in Alaska.
Yes.
You would have thought Chinook salmon would never, right, never have a problem with Alaska.
Right.
And look what's going on. We're seeing, I'm not sure why that's exactly going on, but we're seeing some of it. And you see it like in your work, it sounds like with sagebrush and different things, fires and everything. So the problems are still there. It's just how are we dealing with them? That's
right. And the truth is, people should know this. The federal and state governments are working because the people want it.
Yeah.
We just planted 286,000 sagebrush and bitterbrush this 1 month of October on these big range fires in these migration and winter range for mule deer.
Oh, wow.
I would encourage anybody to just take a great look at what is really going on the, say, Bureau of Land Management lands, National Forest lands, and what's really happening. It'll make you feel a lot better, I promise, and make you want to get involved.
Oh, good.
It's great. River restoration, dam removals,
Yep.
There are failures for sure everywhere, but there always will be. But man, there is some incredible conservation and restoration work going on right now.
Let's take a quick break for a word from our sponsors. Dette Flies, established in 1928, is the oldest family-run fly shop in the world. And I'm all about the history and fly fishing, which is one reason I am super stoked to have Dette on as a sponsor this year. Long before I made my first order with Dette, I remember hearing stories about the quality and the history and always wanting to connect deeper with them. So that time has come now, and I share the Dette tradition with you. Located in Livingston Manor on the banks of Willowemoc Creek, Dette is your welcoming place on the creek or online. Their retail and online shop have a large selection of flies, materials, fly gear, outdoor lifestyle items, books, and more. Dette Flies inventory consists solely of products that meet every angler's demand for highest quality and service. Of course, they offer fly fishing and casting lessons as well as guided trips. For more information, visit Dette Flies at wetflyswing.com/Dette or give them a call, 845-439-1166. That's wetflyswing.com/Dette, Dette. You support this podcast by clicking over through that link to Dette. Okay, let's get back to the show. And we've covered some of these. We covered one down the Klamath Dam removals was a really awesome.
Yeah.
Talked a little bit about that, but I want to talk a little bit on the podcast just so we don't miss that, so people can take this conversation further. But so the Backcountry Hunters and Anglers podcast and blast. So we know how it got started. How do you, when you go into that, I mean, how are you finding topics, right? There's so many topics. How do you choose your topics? That's always a good question I'm always thinking about.
That's a good one. And you're doing more episodes than I'm doing. I'm getting 2 a month right now.
Yeah.
Every 2 weeks. And so stuff goes uncovered.
Yeah.
Like I can't get to it. I like to do stuff. Books have been a big focus of that podcast. So we had Doug Brinkley on. Tom McGuane has been on. Was one of my all-time favorite. He's a novelist, American novelist. And who's also probably one of the greatest fly fishermen, and fishing writers in history.
Yeah.
And so I tend towards writers because I read a lot and I know who's out there.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to get John Gierak and David James Duncan.
Yeah.
That's definitely something I want. But I don't even try to balance it, man. But but I'll do issues like we just did the Ambler Road up in Alaska, which is a proposed new industrial corridor, 211 miles to the headwaters of the Kobuk River.
Oh, now where is that? What part of Alaska is that?
It's right along the Brooks Range, north central.
North Central, okay.
And it bisects the migration route of the beleaguered Western Arctic caribou herd.
Oh, right.
And in my personal opinion, and the opinion of a lot of people, we don't need it. We don't want it.
No.
No. And going across the headwaters of the Koyukon through the Kobuk, 2,904 stream crossings with culvert.
Wow.
Gravel mines to build the road. So I've been working on that one. I do a lot of research. We did the Snake River Dams podcast. We did that one.
I saw it. Yep.
Yep. And I'll do anything that I think is part of this movement. This movement that I feel is building from the bottom up.
Yeah.
That recognizes the power and importance of our connection to the earth and the waters and fishing and hunting and regenerative agriculture. All of the things that are pieces of this puzzle that make up the relationship of human beings to the earth, which sustains our every endeavor.
Right.
I think of that John Jeavons quote a lot. All of man's pretensions, his most beautiful art, music, all of our endeavors depend on the fact that there's 6 inches, I'm paraphrasing, 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains.
Yeah. God, that is good. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to go. There's so many topics I want to cover. And like most of these, we won't be able to get to all of them. But we'll have the podcast. Tell me about BHA, just high level. I know you're not necessarily directly affiliated with them, but you have kind of the name in the podcast title. But for somebody that doesn't know much about what they have going, how to connect, what would you say about BHA?
Well, the reason, so I've been involved with them forever just because I knew all the people who became part of it, But Backcountry Hunters and Anglers it's a hunting and fishing conservation group that is really focused around issues about the public lands. And the public lands being the 640 million acres of National Forest, Bureau of Land Management, Bureau of Rec, fishing refuges, which, by the way, is a unique institution in the world.
Right.
And so BHA formed to do that, to kind of be a grassroots advocacy organization centered around public lands issues. Like in Kentucky, like if you're in the Daniel Boone National Forest, right? Or Missouri, I think is the Mark Twain. In Alabama, it's the Bankhead. In Florida, the Ocala, And those, because we have all these public landscapes, which are available to all of us, there are always going to be issues. And those issues also, because public lands in the West are the source of 63% of all the available water.
Jeez.
Because they're the higher country, right?
Right.
Those lands are always, we should be in conflict over the management of those lands. We need the best ideas to win. And so we needed a hunters and anglers and nature lovers, conservationists organization to sort of advocate for the great things, study those great, what would be great, right? What would be good here, and then to be able to oppose the bad ideas. And so I think that's it pretty much in a nutshell, which then is a awfully large.
Get the people talking, right? That's the whole thing I always go back to on this stuff, is I think that's what you're saying, right? Is that you got to have the ideas. There's going to be some bad ones. There's going to be some great ones, but you got to get people talking, right? Is that the starting point? Yeah,
for sure. And I always tell people, like on this, like BHA too, it's, you have to understand that conflict is good. We were talking about the meritocracy of podcasts and social media.
Yeah.
If everybody's just joining hands and singing Kumbaya all the time, some really bad ideas go through.
That's boring too.
It's boring, and the dumber ideas can prevail.
Oh, right. Gotcha. So how do you do it when you're with your podcast, when you're out there? Are you thinking, without going to the extreme, but trying to say, hey, this is going to be a topic that's really going to potentially go viral? Are you thinking about any of that stuff, like maybe something controversial, that sort of thing? Or how do you do your podcast? Is that like, because
I don't think of it that way. I think of what might be, I'm kind of selfish in that way. I think of what really interests me.
Yeah.
And then I can bring that that my interest to it. So a lot of the podcasts have been stuff that I just wanted to learn.
Yeah, right.
And I figured there was some universality in that, right? That other people might see.
It's true. It's true. I mean, I think that the number one thing from a podcast host is to be successful. And I've interviewed some great podcast, mentors and stuff, but they say curiosity is the number one thing. You can't fake it. You can't fake curiosity on a podcast, so you gotta be curious about the topic.
Right. And you gotta, I did, the Southern Environmental Law Center early on in the podcast thing. And it was just about clean water, right? How do you get it? What are the laws and stuff? And I think about in that news magazine, The Week, they have that page. It's called Boring But Important. And so I'm perfectly willing. The Southern Environmental Law Center podcast turned out to be great. It was not boring at all. It was like intense. But I'm willing to take on stuff like this Waters of the U.S. rule, that might seem uninteresting to a lot of people. But if you'll ride with me, I always think about taking a ride in a pickup, If you'll ride with me, it'll blow your mind just exactly how relevant this is to the things that you love.
Right. Wow. Well, I mean, I want to take it out here. I want to, kind of respect your time, make sure we take it out here pretty quick. But I had a few more questions here. And one of them, we kind of have this kind of conservation partner shout out segment to help wrap things up. But, I think we've talked about a lot of them. Are there any other groups, kind of we could give a shout out to, you think maybe we haven't talked about today that can get people thinking other big groups, or have we talked about most of them today?
No, we haven't. I think that we need a more localized, get involved locally as well, We talked about Ducks Unlimited and all. Check out we just finished this project. I'm so proud of this with the Mule Deer Foundation. And you may be living in Florida or something and go, man, I've never even seen a mule deer,
right?
But I have a 23-person man and woman crew planting these sagebrush and these other native species on these giant range fires in the West.
Wow.
And I've been doing this for 7 years as well, 7 seasons. And the Mule Deer Foundation is doing these incredible large-scale, landscape-scale projects across the West, and in Alaska for black-tailed deer. The Ruffed Grouse Society is advocating for something that I think is so incredibly important, which is to there's a lot going on, right? So we have not managed, there's forests that are now growing in places that used to be grassland or edge habitat, right? Yep. And there's a lot of eastern cedar encroachment, which blocks out light to native plants that in Native American times would have been maintained by fire.
Sure.
So there's all of this biodiversity work being done by the Ruffed Grouse Society. Pheasants Forever is doing huge projects across America. They have Quail Forever with them about reintroducing fire in a sustainable and holistic way to landscapes that haven't had it since white settlement. And that is bringing back not just bobwhite quail, which are incredibly wonderful to hunt, right?
Yep.
But it is also doing watershed health, pollinator regenerants, native plants that come back with monarchs and all of these native bee species, right? And what it is everything is connected to everything else, is like Native Americans had tried to explain to us a long time ago.
Yeah. They knew what they were doing, didn't they?
They knew what they were doing, and they were kind of selectively farming this huge landscape for them without taking so much from it that they wiped it out, right?
Yeah.
Like you think about, I've been in Alabama a lot in the last couple of years, and the Coosa River had all these fish weirs on it, and the fish would swim into these weirs. The Creek Indians could go and just collect a week's worth of fish, in 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
And then those fish weirs are now under 20 feet of water because we wanted those rivers for navigation.
Oh, right.
It was a trade, right?
Yep.
But anyway, there's restoration all over. Quail Forever, Pheasants Forever, Mule Deer Foundation, the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Right. Tons.
I mean, the Elk Foundation, if you love native wildlife like grizzly bears and People go, well, aren't they anti-wolf?
Right.
They're not anti-wolf. They're pro-elk.
Exactly. Well, that gets into it. Yeah, I mean, that gets into a whole other conversation, right?
It does, but you don't have wolves without elk.
Yeah.
And so the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation's project over 30 years now of buying conservation easements or making sure that elk have a winter range in the West have been the linchpin of restoration of all kinds of species and landscapes and like just nature writ large in the West that would not have happened without the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation.
Yeah, that's huge.
And so it's real, man. And it's kind of unique to America, like that all these citizens believe in this stuff with their $20.
Right.
You know, and going to banquets and meeting people like at Pheasants Forever, you go to Pheasant Fest, you just meet some of the most interesting people in the world. You go to Trout Unlimited stuff like in Michigan, where it all started, you know. You meet some of the most interesting people you'll ever meet.
I know. God, that's so good. I mean, there's so much good stuff there. You mentioned, a couple topics. I mean, wolves, and obviously that's a huge topic. I don't bring this up to try to, like we were saying, try to create some, discussion about like a hot point. But for me, I think of diversity. I think of like any natural population. I always think of this, right? The more diverse it is, it seems like the better. You know, the more diverse,
the more resilient it is.
Yeah, more resilient. So what's your take? Yeah. Give us high level just on wolves, in general. And, we don't have to go deep on this, but I think there's a lot of people that think, even hunters, right? Lots of hunters are like, wow, why do we want wolves? They're killing our animals. Like, what's your take? Give it to the general population. What should we know?
Well, I could enrage everybody simultaneously.
There you go.
The world needs a few. I think of wolves as kind of like myself. The world needs a few of us. It can't take a lot of us.
Right.
And the truth of it is that wolf recovery in the West, reintroduction is a little bit different. It's a more nuanced idea, right?
Yeah.
Wolf recovery in the West has been an incredible success story of the Endangered Species Act. And in places like most of Montana, that has been successful, and the wolves have not destroyed everything. Nor have killing a few wolves caused any kind of cataclysms in wolf land.
Yeah, that's it. Right. So that's it. So things are working. So basically with this wolf reintroduction, things are working this stuff's working. Like there's wolves out there that are natural and breeding and and they're not killing every elk out there.
No, but I mean, they have to be managed.
Yeah.
And they should be managed at the state level when they are recovered to the ESA guidelines.
Gotcha.
And there's a Alfred Lloyd Tennyson poem, nature, so careful of the type she seems, so careless of the one. It's like if you have wolves on the landscape and they're chasing somebody's cows on private land, that people aren't going to put up with that.
Yeah, no.
And so you have to be able, you have to be able to take care of that. And you have to have, that's called a social tolerance. And social tolerance is built through pragmatic decisions. And then the most angry of the people who hate everything, hate wolves, their ideas will be kind of marginalized by the effectiveness of the policy. And then the people who just love wolves and they love them and they're cuddly and they love them and they just can't stand to see any of them ever injured. Those people will be marginalized as well.
Yeah, that's the extremes.
And it's like, the battle between the wolf haters and what people call the wolf humpers or the wolf lovers.
Right.
Those two extremes they can't run the show,
Right. No, that's the other great point. Yeah.
And to enrage folks, reintroduction, stuff like that was a really hot button, difficult issue. I still believe, and I'm unpopular for this on the wolf-loving side, but I still believe that had we protected habitat, continuity, migration corridors, winter range for elk, that the elk would have, that the wolves would have recovered in the Rockies if they were protected by the ESA, and they would have recovered slowly, and there would have been a lot less fury.
Right. Naturally, more naturally.
More naturally, and then you get these the wolves are such an incredible species. You get these disperser individuals who they're kind of like me or you in a way. They like got to see what's over the next hill.
Right. They take off to California, right? That one wolf.
Take off to California or Missouri, or like we had one up here that got hit on the highway in Vail, Colorado, that was collared up here where I live.
Oh, wow. So
you just have this species that is inherently fascinating and individualistic. And I value it completely. I feel kinship with wolves and stuff. But like, you can't have like a 24 wolf super pack.
Yeah.
Racing through somebody's cattle ranch.
Exactly. Well, and I think it goes back to, I talk about this just with water and rivers too. There's places where, we have had a lot of influence, human influence that's impacted, and you can't just let it just completely go on its own because it needs a little bit of help until it can get to that point, right? Where it's like a Yellowstone National Park or something like that.
Yep, exactly. And especially when in the West, particularly, everywhere, we have to have private land as part of our conservation vision.
Yeah.
And that land is owned by people like me and you, and we have like concerns because it's ours. And so you have to have incentives and deals and handshakes, and you probably have to have a law somewhere that says, well, you can't kill the last red cockaded woodpecker, dude.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And then you shake hands and drink a cup of coffee and say, how are we going to make this work?
Yeah.
Because it has to work on private land.
That's the key.
And it has to work for all of us on some level, Yep.
People talking again, right? I'm pretty sure you heard a lot of that. Just keep people, whatever side you're on, if you're talking, if you're having coffee, if you're in that pickup together, right? It's a better chance.
Yeah, for sure. And a majority of people do recognize intact natural landscapes, conservation, biodiversity, hunting and fishing as a value to be preserved and conserved and carried on.
Yeah, so you think the majority, most people in this country, whether maybe you haven't ever left the city, but you think most of those people still value that. They understand that.
Well, I think that they might. I think we're increasingly abstracted. But if you were to teach people somehow where their water comes from, you would have a whole new generation of conservationists.
Yeah. Right. Or where their chicken comes from or any of that.
Yeah, exactly. And in that case, you might have a whole lot of people wanting to buy chickens from a local guy.
Oh, man. Yeah. God. What's education? I think about back to the American buffalo, when it was down on the brink of extinction, and all that, some of those people, they had their farms, and then people were even displaying them in the Smithsonian. Yeah. And that was huge because people were like, wow, okay, I'm looking at a buffalo now. I understand it, right? It's like that education is huge.
Yes. And the celebration of that as an American value, like Teddy Roosevelt did, where he saw the ruin of the American resources as a betrayal of the American dream. That was huge, and it still is. I always say, man, don't lower your expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like your kids deserve to swim in that creek, right? Yeah. You and your wife deserve, as American citizens, to go down to a creek and have the kids playing in it and catching crawdads and fishing with a bobber. Don't lower your expectations.
Right, that's it. You said 640 million acres. Are those acres decreasing, increasing, staying the same, those public lands?
They're mostly staying the same, and there are laws against selling the public lands.
Yeah.
They can be traded, and in certain circumstances, federal public lands can be sold, but it's unusual, and it has to go through a big process because the citizens expect to have retained our birthright, right? The lands that we own as American citizens in common.
Yeah.
The government can't just wake up one day. They've tried, by the way.
Right, they've tried.
Yeah, and Herbert Hoover tried to give them all away to the states.
Oh, wow, God. How did that go?
The states didn't want them because these are lands. People should understand. This is the subject of my book, but these are lands that were left over after all the Homestead Acts gave away everything that was like farmable or livable, right? Mm-hmm. And then if you live, say, in Mississippi or Alabama, what state are you in?
Oregon.
So Oregon would be different. Like that, the Bureau of Land Management land in eastern Oregon was not settled by people because it didn't have any water.
Oh, right.
So it remained in federal hands because it was never claimed. But like if you're in Mississippi where there's lots of water, that land, the Bienville National Forest, for instance, that was land that was cut over and farmed so hard that all the topsoil kind of disappeared and it was abandoned and sold to the federal government by paper companies or timber companies that no longer had any use for it, right?
Wow, gotcha.
So, and that was done under the Federal Weeks Act of 1911, where it allowed the federal government to buy land that was so degraded that nobody knew what they could to do with it. And that's the Bankhead National Forest in Alabama, for instance, the Tuskegee National Forest in Alabama, the Kisatchie in Louisiana. It's just like the history of this stuff is so incredible. That's why I've spent 3 years on it. But
I love that.
In Montana, eastern Montana, of course, has very little water, right? It's dry prairie.
Yep.
And so a lot of that remained in federal hands, or after the Dust Bowl, under the federal Bankhead-Jones Act, the federal government was able to take back land that had been abandoned by homesteaders who were starving. And that became Bankhead-Jones lands, which are now managed by the Bureau of Land Management. But these are not lands that people wanted and the federal government said no.
Oh, right.
They were lands that were unclaimed. We gave away millions upon millions upon millions of acres under the Homestead Acts. And I totally acknowledge it. This was after the Native American Wars, right?
Right.
We conquested that land from the people who are here. It's funny because the Romans did something very similar with their expansion where they were fighting the Gauls and the Celts and the Saracens,
Yeah.
And for about 250 years, the Romans had what was called the Ager Publicus, and it was public land. And it had been taken from conquested peoples. And people lived on that land. They ran goats and they lived out there. And then over time, the Roman legion and the emperors, as it became more and more corrupt, they took over that land and took it away from the people. And so that's something to think about if you believe that history doesn't repeat itself, but it can rhyme.
Yeah.
If you look at the assaults, if the plans on selling off the American public lands or giving them to the states so that the states can sell them off.
Right.
It's really reflected in that Roman time of Ager Publicus. And it's fascinating.
That is. No, history repeats itself. Yeah, I mean, I don't even know. Again, just thinking back some tragic stuff, but I was, just like the Holocaust, the German, Hitler. I mean, he, some of that stuff, right? He looked back at the U.S. and the way the U.S. handled the Native Americans with essentially kind of a genocide, right? He used that as a way to say, hey, look what the U.S. did. That's all we're doing.
Yep. And we're taking Poland.
Yeah, we're taking Poland. The same exact things, or at least that's how he thought about it.
Yeah, for sure. And it's it's complicated, and we talk about history, and it being sanitized, right, by the victor.
Yeah, that's right.
My take nowadays, I got to give you this before we could sign up.
Yeah, let's do it.
My take nowadays is that these public lands are owned by all Americans, and that includes the Native Americans. And if you look at the Bears Ears National Monument Plan, which was became controversial after 2016, but before that was not so much. There are 5 Native American tribes there who worked on the management for the Bears Ears National Monument in Utah. And the future of the American public lands lies in really good tribal engagement and Native American management to help. And it's going to be better with the input from the people who had known that land for 10,000 years. It's not just a seat at the table. It's we need that input now for the future management of public lands, and then we can hold on to this wonderful thing together. This is kind of like wolves. We're touching on a topic now that's a different, big. Check out the original management plan for the Bears Ears National Monument.
Okay.
And you'll see why, and you'll see why it was so opposed by some folks who don't want that.
Gotcha. You're right. This is good. Well, we'll put, like I said, your podcast has a great resource of episodes, so I'm sure some of these topics, they can follow up people listening out on that. Tell us on your book before we let you get out of here. What's the name of the book you have going, and give a shout out there?
Well, I think I don't know yet, but I think the subtitle is Journeys on America's Public Lands.
Uh-huh.
And I've been traveling for a couple of years on it, and writing on it for a couple of years, and I'm maybe a year off on delivery, but it's just about the history of the American public lands.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second part is just profiles some National Forest or Bureau of Land Management lands and like what's really there. For instance, like in the Apalachicola Forest in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, and the history there is so incredibly interesting that I think that if you read that chapter of the book, you would become an advocate for keeping that land in public hands and managed by the U.S. Forest Service forever. Right. And anybody that suggested different, you would be able to look at this chapter and go like, but what about?
Yeah. Yeah. Wow, this is good. So when is this book, do you think it'll be out?
I think I can do it. I don't know how long it's going to take to bring it into full shape, but probably 2025.
Okay, 25. Good.
And if I can't get that, I'm in big trouble. So
yeah.
I'm going elk hunting tomorrow, but it's kind of a narrow window.
I love it. You're going out. We'll update the link in 25 when we get there and put that in the show notes as well. But I'll let you get out of here and get to your hunting preparation. But I just wanted to say, I think we'll have to get you back on if you can down the line, because I think there's a lot of This has been a great conversation. I think we could talk for hours here and keep going on some of this stuff. So I just appreciate all your time today and all the good work you've been doing over the years, and excited to keep in touch with you.
Yeah, you too, Dave. I appreciate your interest here. Like your listenership is like perfect for this. This is how it works.
Yeah. This is the groups. This is like a small community, ours, who don't know about you, and now they know about you, right? And then they're going to learn about your stuff and your other groups that you're supporting and all that.
Yeah, and it's just like, be engaged, man. Like, you got 70 on this planet in this assembly of molecules. Like,
that's right.
Do something with it.
Do something with it. Awesome. All right, Hal, we'll be talking to you soon.
Yes, sir. Thank you, man.
That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country, so if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are, and I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.